So welcome to the first ever episode of The One. And in honor of Black History Month, we've got a great educationalist, one of the first on our show. So let me introduce you. We've got Angeli, who was born and raised in Manchester and is currently a social action and senior youth worker, a project worker and has been for the past 20 years, holding professional qualifications and training in community and youth work, coaching, counselling, and leadership and management. Angeli is the Education and Finance Director of TAP, the African Pop Project Limited, a social inclusion not-for-profit company working to deliver products and services, events and information for social inclusion, advancement of the African diasporic community of Manchester, UK, and globally. Angeli, welcome to the first ever episode of The One. That was a lot. And I've missed out a lot because my girl's got loads of letters after her name. So give her the respect that she deserves, man. As you know, we're not told about it's Black History Month. Tell the viewers a little bit about yourself.
Oh, what is there to tell? So, yeah, I'm Angeli Sweeny. A lot of people call me Angel. Angeli means angel in Italian. So for those people who can't pronounce my name, what call me Angela, Angelique, Angelina, I'm like, stop, it's just, let's go with Angel. And yeah, born and raised in Manchester, live here. I do full-time youth and community work. I'd call myself a practitioner or an educationalist, or an emancipator, that's a good word.
I like that.
And yeah, I do a lot of work around social action. I do a lot of work around emancipation and empowerment for young people, but particularly young Black and brown people. Yeah, and that's what I do as kind of like a full-time role. So yeah, I lead all the project management of the offer that we deliver for a charity that I work for in Manchester. And then my role within TAP or TAP, the African Pop Project, I am Education and Finance Director and Community Lead for the project. Yeah, we've been in operation since 2017. So it's our third birthday coming up soon, which is amazing. And yeah, so that's just a small part of what I do.
No.
I'll go any further, I'll leave it there.
It's all good, man. Well, as you know, it's Black History Month in the UK. Before we get into like, obviously some of the questions that I've thrown out to you for you to kind of review, just historically in terms of Black history and how it's been taught in the UK, what are your thoughts on that?
Wow. It hasn't, has it? It hasn't been taught.
It hasn't.
If you're talking about mainstream curricula, then no, it hasn't been taught. Yeah, it might have been touched upon, and what has been touched upon isn't really, It's the usual Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, civil rights, oh, you were slaves. That's about it. And a couple of great Black Britons, Lenny Henry, what's the guy from the newsreader, Tessa Sanderson, and a few others. And that's pretty much it. So for me, I recognize that unless we kind of do it ourselves, Black history isn't going to get taught in this country, and that's just the long and short of it,
That leads us great into one of the questions I asked you. What do you believe are the fundamental historical issues within the Black community? Because you mentioned something in your introduction, and you were just kind of explaining your work and what your business does, and some of the challenges you face in terms of how the Black community prefers to interact with other races rather than, their own, us. Do you think, or a lack of understanding in terms of knowing your history is a reason why that attitude is perpetuated?
Yes, definitely. Categorically, yes. It's lack of knowledge, it's lack of awareness, it's lack of pride. It's lack, it's a deficit. I think as a people, we operate on a deficit model, socioeconomically. psychologically, sorry, in many different areas, we operate on a deficit. We're always on the back foot, if that makes sense. And that kind of speaks to the whole equality argument, which I don't kind of, clearly we want equality, but equality isn't good enough. You know, we need equity, and equity is being able to say, well, boom, you know, if you start in a race and you're at the 10 steps ahead and then everybody else is 10 steps behind, clearly you're always going to win. And then on top of that, 10 steps behind, and you've got obstacles in the way that you're tripping over. So yeah, definitely. In terms of how do we start to address those historical issues, I know it sounds cliche, but education is massive, and re-education. You know, there's been so much work and books written around the miseducation of the Negro and miseducation of the Black boy, and education of subnormal schools, you know, like circa the 1970s in London and such. So yeah, education is the key. And that education doesn't have to come from state schools as we see it. You know, I truly believe it needs to come from ourselves. It needs to come from our parents, our grandparents, our extended family, our friends, our communities, and our networks. You know, because if you wait for this country to educate us about who we are, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, sometimes I find that when you're talking when you start talking about Black history, especially within our community, there's almost like the only way I can describe it is like they're embarrassed, and almost want to shy away from even some of our heroes. Like for me, one of my favorite heroes, one of my political heroes is Malcolm X. And I know that can be controversial to some. When you read about Malcolm X and you realize, you know, you see him for who he is. When you read his bio, he wasn't, you know, the aggressive, you know, angry black man as what's been portrayed. Yes, he had a period of time where he saw things and he was like, you know, by any means necessary. But at the same time, as he went on in life, he started to see things a little bit differently. And one of the issues I find when I'm talking to Black people about Black history and trying to engage with Black people about Black history is they always want to lean towards the Martins. They never really want to talk about the Malcolm X. Can you talk on that a little bit as to why you think that is?
That's indoctrination. I think that's propaganda.
Right.
I think that what we've been taught in school was always this passive, non-violent approach to our own emancipation or the struggle, so to speak. And I definitely know when I was in school, my favorite subject was history, and English and art. And I know that in history, clearly we got taught about slavery first, and then we got taught about civil rights. And definitely, you know, Malcolm X's name was mentioned, but most of that, if you want to call it syllabus, was talking about Martin Luther King and what he did, and this non-violent, passive, almost master type of condition. So I think that indoctrination over the years, whether it be in school or through Black History Month or wherever it may be, when talking about civil rights in America in general, for Black people, I just think that's been really compounded. And I think that we've kind of internalized that. So when we talk about Black History Month, the initial response is shame, because what we got taught is that we were slaves. And everybody remembers being in the classroom when they put on film Roots or they started talking about slavery, and you might be the only Black person or one of only a few Black people in the room, and all of your white friends and whoever else everybody turns to look at you, you know. And it's that deep-seated shame, I think, that comes up every time you mention Black History Month, just in general in this country. That's it. I just don't think that. I think this idea of an aggressive Black man, that is a historical issue. That is something that has been perpetuated, and we can talk more about that later on. But I definitely think that Black people have been programmed to almost believe that we should be subservient and passive, and that we should almost play the victim, and that the moment that we start to assert ourselves and self-actualize, like Malcolm X might have been talking about, we're seen as a threat, and there's something wrong with that. So yeah, it's just this constant conditioning.
Do you think religion's played a part in that as well, or would you think?
Definitely. Come on now, of course. From when you know the Portuguese came in 1492, and from then religion played a part in it. Even before then, I think the Moors took over. I think it was Portugal in Spain around 711, and then clearly it was a Muslim country, and they ruled a lot of Europe for over 700 years. And you can see the evidence of that, whether it be in the architecture, the language, the maths, whatever it may be, and all of the great contributions that they made to the world. So what we find now is when they finally got run out, I think it was 1492, 2 years later, Columbus turns up. It just seems a bit of it's not even a coincidence. So there was definitely this concerted effort using religion to whitewash and get rid of anything that could be seen as black excellence, black religion, black culture, black faith, etc., etc. And clearly during the period of enslavement, religion was literally used as a beating stick. You know, if you talk about how the Bible was used and how many thousands of revisions of the Bible that we know, particularly King James, but we'll talk about that. It speaks to, you know, slave, you must be subservient to your master, and then you've got all the indoctrination and the propaganda around Jesus and how he supposedly looked as, you know, a white man with blonde brunette hair, etc. And again, just this constant conditioning over the years, and religion has played a massive part. Do
you think it's time, well, let me ask you this, and it's probably going to lead on to a question that we probably can talk about later on. Do we need to start looking back at maybe some of our religions that we have used? Do you think that's something that we need to start looking back at as black people, to say, okay, come away from Western religions and start to, in order to go find ourselves, we might have to start to go back down a road where we start to look at what our ancestors used to do. And I know that there is a fear. I know for everyone there's a fear, you know, when it comes on to doing that, because of the, you know, voodoo and witch doctor and everything else that comes with it. What are your thoughts on that? Because I've heard it before, and I know that that's going to be a reason why. That's a reason why a lot of us kind of steer away from.
But where does the idea come from around voodoo and witchcraft and religion? Where does that come from? Now I feel like I'm interviewing you, but that's what I always ask.
I would say it's definitely been taught, and I think it's been taught through various religions, i.e. Christianity. And anyone that is, you know, and I've got family who are Christians. I grew up Christian. But I know that anything that's seen as being against the Bible is deemed as being satanic. And therefore, if you start talking about looking back at the religions of your ancestors, the first thought is, you know, witch doctor, or, you know, some voodoo, you know, something along those lines, where it's just a straight up no, because you're entering like, you know, some weird world.
And that again is indoctrination. Going back to the pharaohs and Kemet, the way that they used to practice their religion, you know, the religion of the sun god. At one point it was monotheistic, so it was one god. Then it was, well, before that it was several gods. Then it was one god. When I think it was Akhenaten came in the second kind of like period, and then we talk about religions in particularly West Africa, like Voodoo, which was an actual religion and still is a religion. And that's where it's so voodoo is a corruption of voodoo, and voodoo is an actual religion. It's a faith practice. If we understand that Africans in general, how many thousands of years ago their faith practice or religion was around nature, was around being at one with the earth, was around looking at the signs and you know, communing with nature and the animals and all of those things there. A lot of those things get poo-pooed in the Bible. What I've seen over the years and what I've read and what I've come to understand is that our religion has literally, I'm going to swear, has been bastardized. You know, it's been corrupted. So what would be the, in ancient Kemet, the way that they would mummify the bodies to send it on to the afterlife and everything that went along with that, that became known as necromancy, because they saw it as a worship of the dead, and it wasn't a worship of the dead, it was a veneration of the ancestors. So it was just, you know, a slight difference of understanding and perception, but that was corrupted. Then you've got voodoo on the religion, which was corrupted into voodoo. Then you've got this whole, you know, like some of the horror films that we see, like zombies and stuff like that. That comes from an actual, you know where that comes from, don't you? That comes from some African practices and rites, where the actual name for the person who has been taken over, so to speak.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, a spirit or whatever. The word for it is zombie, essentially. And it's crazy how America picked up on that and turned it into this massive multi-million pound franchise, and if you want to call it voyeuristic entertainment, when in actual fact it's actually part of something that is part of our culture and our history. And I could go on and on in terms of the way that our religion has been corrupted and has been spun back to us to be something wicked and evil. And so the minute it's mentioned, we're like, oh no, but oh no, not at all. That's why I love Beyonce.
Wow, okay.
I never used to be a fan of her, but at the minute she's absolutely doing it for African religion, and she's putting it on the map, and she's does that make sense?
No, that makes that, what you said is so heavy. It's so heavy because my wife was kind of the same, and even me. And I remember watching, I don't know if you saw, for all those out there, most people have heard of Nipsey Hussle. You've probably heard of him as well. And I remember watching his funeral, and his mother was actually pouring out some water, and she was unsure about what was going on. Because obviously I believe at the time she wasn't raised in Africa, so she was kind of being advised on what to do and kind of coached on what to do. She was a little bit unsure, but she was explaining that this is something that had been passed down through his through his culture, and it's a cultural ceremony. Yeah. And I remember when she was doing it, she was pouring out the water. The first thought that came into my head was, is that some voodoo stuff? Not serious. And I remember the wife thinking the same thing. And the reason why we thought that is because of Western religion. And it was only when we asked my wife asked a Ghanaian friend of hers if she had seen it, and she had kind of explained that yes, and then she'd gone into the history of what of it. Yeah, it was like it actually made you it was like a wow moment. Like, wow, I didn't realize it was so far removed from our initial thought of being, some, demonic type activity. It's crazy when you start to realize the way we do things and start to look into that. You realize a lot of what we do is just it's not evil. Do you know what I mean? It's just a natural way of life.
It's not evil. It's actually the closest to God, however you see God, that one can get, if that makes sense. Yeah. Because if we understand that the ancients or our ancestors in the past were closer to understanding the source and the stars and the planets and the earth and all of those things there, if that's what you ascribe to, then how can it be, and then if you look at the great civilizations that we had and everything that we achieved, that to me is no. We had tribal warfare, and people will say, well, Africans used to fight amongst themselves and but that's completely different. So that's ancestor veneration, that's pouring libation, and that's something that we do at all of our events. We've had a mental health event at the Manchester Metropolitan University, and we poured libation on that carpet. We did that. Right. Well, it wasn't on the carpet, it was into a plant, but and we did that because we recognized that we have to start from base, and we really have to respect and honor that, or else nothing that we do is going to be fruitful. Nothing that we do is going to be authentic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hear you. And what's the term? Libation.
Ancestor veneration. So it's a very old practice. It comes from ancient Kemet. I don't call it Egypt, I call it Kemet. Kemet means the land of the blacks. Right. It's a liquid offering for the dead, typically water. Now you go to a Jamaican funeral and they're pouring white rum, same thing. Do you know what I'm saying?
Do you know what I mean? Even when you watch like hip hop videos and see the man's in LA, what they're doing? Pouring liquor out. Yeah.
You pour a little on the concrete. And it's basically a liquid offering for the dead.
Wow.
It's meant to mimic the rhythms of the Nile River being the source of life and death, which seems pretty apt and pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely.
And yeah,
it's information. It's information like that that needs to come out, because it helps you to accept who you are.
Of
Do you know
course.
what I mean? And you're not afraid then of your history.
As demonic.
Yeah.
You know, even when it comes to things like, you know, smudging and burning sage and Palo Santo and crystals and nature worship and barefoot walking and all of those things, that's all become a bit of a hype in Western culture now. Everybody's jumping on it and saying, oh, it's Eastern practice. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that this was being done in Africa 8,000, 9,000 years ago. Wow. You know, nobody wants to talk about that. Everybody wants to give it to somebody else rather than Black African people or African Black people. Sorry.
So yeah, we just touch on something you said there. So in terms of, I know you've worked with youth for a long time, 20 plus years. When it comes on to Black history and explaining the greatness of Black people, what are how is that received with the youth? When you start to go into history, how do they receive that? And do you actually see a change based on them becoming confident in knowing who they are?
Over the years, it's been received okay. It's been received well by probably more Black children. But just in general, when I've spoken about Black history or Black people, it's been received pretty much on the whole okay. I'm that youth worker where somebody will say something, make a sweeping statement, and I'll be like, stop right there. What does that mean? Where did that come from? Let's talk about this. Where did you get that from? And I'll do all that type of work. Black History Month, I don't necessarily throw it on young people, if that makes sense. And clearly this month it's been difficult because I'm not doing a lot of face-to-face work, but I'm still doing stuff online. So case in point, tomorrow I'm going into school to do some face-to-face coaching work, and I'm working with a year 9 pupil who has written a Black Lives Matter presentation, and she's going to be using that and showing that to some of her friends at school through school networks. So that is amazing to be able to sit down with a young Black girl and talk about Black history and BLM. And that's really well received. I remember, I think it was last year, Black History Month, I was in a youth club in the middle of a traditionally white working class area, mostly white children there. And we got talking about, you know, Black history, etc., etc. And then I was telling them about a lady called Jane Elliott, and then I was speaking about other bits and bats. But I was saying, technically, we're all cousins out here. And they were like, what? I said, yeah, you're my cousin. And they were like, how? No, I'm not your cousin, but we're different. I said, colours. I said, yeah, we are. I've got some melanin in my skin, just a bit more than you, and you've got a bit less. But we're still related. We're 30 to 50th related cousins out here, if you look at, you know, the timelines. And they were like, wow, tell us more. So we had that conversation. And then by the end of the session, they were walking out saying, yes, fam. And it was just funny, but it was sweet, because that is the way that you educate young people. Because we always say, oh, we need to educate our Black young people, but we need to educate our white young people as well. Yeah. Because they've been lied to as well. You know, they've been indoctrinated as well. And that is the insidiousness of racism. It affects us all, you know, it really, really does. So for me, I'm just about putting it out there on the table and just illuminating, saying, this is what it is. This is where we've come from. Don't get it twisted. Don't believe what your teachers tell you. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be polite, respectful, and take in your stuff, but always go away and do your own research. And if you can't, come and speak to me, or, you know, so I'm about emancipating them and getting them to that self-inquiry and that critique. Don't just take on board what somebody told you and believe it.
You know, when you talk about Black history and you're obviously addressing the youth at this point, and you're addressing obviously diverse races, I take it, not just Black people or Black youth. Let's say there's a thought process that a particular race invented something, and then obviously you're able to expound and actually say, well, hold on, no, that's not the case. When you do that, if you do that, how is that then received? You're able to talk about that?
I have done that, and I do that, and generally it's received with shock, with disbelief, with pride, and that's across the board.
Wow.
Yeah,
across
seriously,
all races,
pretty much. Wow, okay. I tell you, I work with a big South Asian community in the north of Manchester, and And when it comes to Black history, they are on it. They love it. So South Asian, whether it be Pakistani, whether it be Syrian, Libyan, Somalian I work with. Oh God, I mean, one good thing about the youth club that I run and manage is that we have so many different ethnicities who attend our youth club. And one thing that I've done is I've put on the wall, where you come from, we've got this map on the wall, and everybody gets to plot where they're from and write one good thing about where they're from. And then we have a discussion around it every time we get somebody new into the youth club. Forgive me, my cat's come in the room.
No, it's fine.
So if you hear something, it's her. But yeah, I'm all about just celebrating our differences, but also recognizing our commonalities. I'm not about, oh, you know, yeah, Black people did this, Black people did that, so we firing and we're better than everybody else. I'm not elitist or nationalist like that, but I do recognize that I'm about kind of righting the wrongs and readdressing the balance. And if something's a lie, and I know it's a lie, then I'm pointing out that fact.
Are you able to kind of tell the audience who may not know, you know, some of the inventors or some of the things that Black people have done? Are you able to shed any light on some of those inventors?
I was just reading something today. What was the lady called now? I think she was called Davidson. I can't remember her first name. She was called Davidson. And it's random, but I didn't even know this, but she has got the patent for creating women's what can we call it? Basically period pads. She created it. Okay. It was a Black lady who created it, and she's got the patent. And she also created loads of other kind of like personal care type of products, like the toilet roll holder and random stuff like that. But that was really good to see. The guy who invented, a lot of people say it was a Black man who invented the light crossing, you know, the stoplights.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. He actually improved upon it. So before he came along, it was just red and green. And he recognized that it was causing more accidents than it was, you know, stopping. So he came along and improved the patent and put amber in there. So in that respect, he invented the contemporary traffic light that we see today. But he did not invent the traffic light.
Yeah, because I heard that growing up, actually. That it was. I heard that growing up. I heard that.
Is a Black man invented traffic light?
Yeah. No, it's not okay. Okay, no, you've cleared that up.
I've cleared it up. Let me find his name. Wait 1 minute.
Yeah, no problem.
Do you know what I'm talking about? Garrett Morgan
I'm gonna check
was
now.
The original guy, and then the guy who improved upon it. No, I think it was Garrett Morgan. And then you've got the light bulb. People say, oh yeah, you know, it was a Black man who invented the light bulb. No, it wasn't a Black man who invented the light bulb. He invented the filament in the light bulb that enabled it to burn. You know, so as with all inventions and as with all science, but particularly inventions, it's always built upon. It's always taken up. So there's been a lot of Black people who have built upon inventions that are already out there and made them amazing. And what we have today, like the refrigeration unit, like the lift that we use, etc., and they've just built upon these inventions and made them better than they were. And that, for me, is what we need to be kind of like not focusing on, but recognizing that we didn't invent everything out here. We good, but we have to recognize that we're part of world history and there's other people on the planet who invented as well, and it's okay. But we just have to make sure that we put our part in as well. Percy Julian, born 1898 to 1975. He was the first to synthesize the natural product, physostigmine, used to treat glaucoma and pioneer in the industrial large-scale chemical synthesis of human hormones. We know about the first successful heart transplant in the 50s was by a Black man. I'd have to find out his name. We know about Madam C.J. Walker. Everybody knows about her. We might have seen her. There was a really cool series on Netflix. We know about her. We know about Lena Walker, the first female Black president of any race to charter a bank in the United States. Not necessarily an inventor, but a pioneer. Benjamin Banneker. Have you heard of him?
I've not heard of him. No. Wow.
I've not heard of him. G. If it wasn't for Benjamin Banneker, I don't think we'd have the White House. Put it that way.
Jeez.
You know, what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of the emancipated slaves during the Reconstructionist period in America, so I think it was between the 1880s and 1910s, 20s, clearly built up amazing towns. So we have Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street.
Yeah.
But they also were involved in the laying of the foundations for a lot of the historical and monumental, if you want to call it, structures in America. So Washington being a massive one. So Benjamin Banneker was a self-taught African-American mathematician, astronomer, almanac author, and farmer. In the 1750s, he invented the first clock in America.
Wow.
It was the invention that put his talents on display for the country. He was responsible for surveying of territory for the construction of the nation's capital in 1791 after the lead architect quit. So he was responsible for mapping out what Washington looked like and the White House. So when they talk about I think it's the cornerstone or the keystone, it was him who laid it first. And the keystone and the cornerstones in historical American buildings are really significant for some reason, but he laid it first, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Touched upon Madam C.J. Walker, Carter G. Woodson.
Yep.
You've heard of him?
Yeah, I have heard of him, yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say he's an inventor, but boy, he invented a lot, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, authored The Miseducation of the Negro book in 1933, one of the most important books in the 20th century. Launched the celebration of Negro History Week in 1926 in America. So he started Black History Month in 1926, and it was in 1927 that a Ghanaian guy, 1977, sorry, that a Ghanaian guy in this country started it over here. But yeah, he did that. Who else have we got? Yeah, we could go on forever. Right. So the list goes on and on and on. There you go.
Nice.
So there's a lot. And
man.
that's only the ones in America that has been patented, because in America they're very big on patents.
Yeah.
You know, over here we call it copyright. Same thing. If you don't patent something, then it doesn't belong to you. So these are only the inventions that we know of that have been patented. If that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense, man. There's a lot of negativity towards the awakening of the Black community. Do you have any thoughts on this? What are your thoughts?
I've got so many thoughts.
Why do you think that is?
I wrote down cognitive bias.
Right.
I wrote down indoctrination. I wrote down 400, nearly 500 years of anti-Black propaganda. When we think about cognitive dissonance and the way that it works, it's a belief that you have in your mind that you hold true. Somebody else comes along and, refutes that belief, etc., and you have this dissonance in your mind where, oh my God, and you go through this period of not knowing what's real, what's not real type of thing, doubting yourself, etc., doubting your whole thought process. So within that, I understand that the dissonance that is being felt by the world, and particularly white European people, is real. And one thing that I wrote down as well is 7 stages of grief. And this is something that I deal with when I'm working with young people who have gone through bereavement, etc., But when I'm looking at it on a macro level, on a global level, we're seeing the death of capitalism, if that makes sense. We're seeing the final death throes of capitalism, of anti-Black racism, of colonialistic ties. We're basically seeing the demise of this order. And we know through history that civilizations rise and fall. It's just the way the world works. And I definitely think that in terms of the negativity towards the awakening of the Black community, I think it's absolute grief. I think when you look at the 7 stages, the first one is shock. So it's initial paralysis at hearing the bad news. And the second one is denial, trying to avoid the inevitable. And the third is anger, frustrated outpouring of bottled up emotion. And I truly believe that that's where we are now. Shock, denial and anger. And I think that's part of the reason why we see all this negativity towards the awakening, because again, that miseducation of the European says that Black people, or the education thus far of the European says that Black people are inferior, that we have created nothing, that we haven't even been here, that we don't do nothing, that we're victims, that we're consumers, and that we're just a blight on this world. And now that all of this BLM is starting to happen, the movement and the awakening and the wokeness of so many Black people in particular, and the unapologeticness of Black people in that awakening and their Black excellence, it's literally just torn apart everything that they understood about who they were, their place in the world, their understanding as a culture and as a people, and their identity. And that's what's happening now.
Would you say the UK has well, let me ask you like this. Were you surprised?
You broke up for a bit. Say that one more time.
Were you surprised at the reaction that we've seen within the UK on the back of BLM? Is it what you expected? You wasn't surprised?
I wasn't surprised. I was still shocked. I was still angry. I was still frustrated. All those emotions. Right. But I wasn't surprised.
What, in a positive sense, do you think? Or are you talking from a negative?
A bit of both, because I think, one, there's been a negative backlash, and there's been this whole distraction argument and movement around BLM, and saying, oh, well, you've tried to get rid of statues, and you go into the universities and places like the National Trust, and you call in and to banks and universities and saying colonialism and slavery and reparations and all of those things there. And that's kind of distracting from the BLM movement. But then on the other hand, I've seen a real attempt, authentic attempt from big and small companies to really start to embrace this anti-Black agenda and really work to dismantle what we see as the just literal unfairness of society. So I definitely think that there is a real understanding that something needs to change. And there are people and companies and organizations out there who are really wanting to do the work. Some of them are still getting it wrong. Some of them are still finding the feet, but they're trying. And then there's some who are just like, no, not having it, in that stage of denial and anger. They're not having it,
I've seen that, because I don't know if you saw, I know Pure Gym came out with a campaign. Yeah, they came out with a campaign and literally just got it wrong. But you know what? Like you said, there's two ways to look at it. You can just look at it as straight out racism, or you can look at it and say, you know what? They're trying. They've made a mistake. How do you see it?
You know what? It's I don't even think it was racism. I think it's Black History Month, and they were trying to increase their profile. Now we know that when it comes to media, any media, good or bad, any promotion is good promotion. Yeah. And as far as Pure Gym are concerned, everybody's got their name on their lips. Everybody's talking about Pure Gym, good or bad. And it burnt me because, boy, I go to Pure Gym.
Yeah, I was a member as well. I was a member before COVID. But yeah.
I just joined. I've never been a gym head, but I thought, you know what, let me. So I just joined about 5 weeks ago or something, and then this came out. I was like, oh my god! Considering the work that I do and what I champion, I was like, But then I had to sit down and have a stern conversation with myself. But ultimately, I think that it was just the capitalist move. To be honest, I think they got it stupidly wrong. I think that because a Black guy came up with the workout, they thought, oh yeah, he speaks for the whole Black race, so it'll be cool. They'll be all right with it. It's a laugh and a joke, and let's put it out there. And yeah, they got it. I think they got it more than wrong. They knew that it was going to create absolute
mayhem. As a Black community in the UK, this is what I find. I personally think that we allow our American family, and I'll phrase it like that. And I love this phrase, and I coined this phrase, although I probably haven't, I'm not the first one to say it, but I think that we've allowed our American family to do all the heavy lifting for us. And I say that because I feel like when it comes to speaking out, and it's only now, and don't get me wrong, we are doing it now, but I feel like there's a time in history where we've been quite reserved. And we've always allowed America to do everything for us, and then we've kind of reaped the benefits on the back of that. So, you know, they've always been out front speaking up on black issues. Laws are passed, and then we've kind of benefited from some of those over here. And yes, it's America and the UK are completely different, and societies are completely different as well. But there has always been an undertone. How do we now reclaim who we are? How do we reclaim our past and actually step forward and move things forward? Because I feel like now's a great time for us all to come together, regardless of your race, but for us to come together and actually create and really make an impact in the UK.
First thing that I'd say is that my understanding is that, well, it's not even my understanding, it's a fact that race is a social construct. Race doesn't exist. It's an ideology that was created by essentially white men who wanted to control black people and control the narrative as to how we were dehumanized and used for this capitalist gain of slavery or transatlantic slavery. So for me, race doesn't exist. So when we say we, if you're talking about humanity, if you're talking about humans as a people, okay.
Yeah.
If you're talking about melanated humans, I get that. But race, I really don't try to ascribe to that word because it falls back into the indoctrination that we're trying to get away from. So probably for me, I'd start with things like the word race and labels like the word BAME. And we're doing a lot of work in Manchester at the minute on the strategic level with the Mayor's Office and Greater Manchester Combined Authority and City Council to do away with that word, because BAME is a label that is divisive and is really, really damaging. And what we find as a black community, when they say BAME or we work with the BAME community, no, you've worked with a couple Asian men and a few Polish guys, but you've worked with no black people, but they want to tick a box and say they work with the BAME community. So for me, that's really damaging. Same with the word race. When we talk about the word race, labels and identity and putting us in boxes, I don't ascribe to that anymore. Race is a concept that was created, as you know, to basically underpin and explain racism. Don't want to go too much into it in terms of our enslavement and how it came about, but that's what it was basically. And when you check it, there are no races. There are different peoples and different ethnicities, but we all want, and I know it sounds really cliche, and it's not even going to the All Lives Matter camp. It's basically stating a fact. There is no such thing as race. A man came up with it one day in order to be able to beat down a black man and say, you ain't worth nothing, you 3/5 of a human, I'm going to use you and have your kids and have your wife, and you're going to be mine forever, and that's it, because you're a thing. You know, that's where race comes from.
Right. So, and listen, I understand exactly what you're saying, but you can imagine there's going to be some kickback, and some people will obviously disagree and say no, you know, on both sides. So what would you say to them that say, no, we are different? How would you kind of explain to them that, no, look, we are the same? Explain, just expound on that a little bit more for me, because there is going to be...
If I was explaining to a young person or to an adult, I'd break down where the word race comes from and what it means and how it's impacted humanity over the past 500 years. And I'd break down the lie of race, and I'd break down the lie and the absolute wickedness of racism. And I'd show it for what it is, which is just an absolute jack and a lie. Somebody came up with it, and it's impacted 500 years of this world's history. And that's how I'd break it down to say, do you know what you've been living all these years and what you've been, do you know that being held accountable to, kind of like, or being held hostage by a couple man's ideas around race. So eugenics movement that we talk about, and when we talk about medical racism, all of those things there to say that the Negroid race, you know, we had lower intelligence, that our head shapes were different, that women's pelvises were different, that we didn't feel pain like white people. Hence why people like Miriam Lister, who's supposedly the godfather of gynecology, could go and cut open an African woman's womb and take out the uterus, but not do the same to a Irish indentured servant and give her anesthetic, because he truly believed this ideology of the races, that African peoples weren't really human and that they didn't feel pain and that we were akin to cattle, essentially. So going back to your point around USA doing all of the heavy lifting, I think the dynamics and the dichotomies of the UK and the USA are different in that respect, because literally the USA is a melting pot of a culmination, I'd probably say, of capitalism, racism, immigration, colonialism, you know, the list goes on. The UK now, I always see it like this is the analogy. The UK is the head, literally. Don't get it twisted. The UK literally is not innocent. So when people are out here saying the UK is not innocent, they really, really mean it. Great Britain was called Great Britain for a reason. And as you know, they ruled a third of the world for a long time, you know. And when it came to the enslavement of African peoples, Great Britain, the way they finessed it, the way they patterned slavery was next level. It was more heinous, it was more insidious, it was more wicked and evil than any other peoples who had come along and enslaved Africans, more than the Portuguese, more than the Dutch, more than the Spanish. Does that make sense? So for me, the UK is at the heart of it. And I think that's part of the reason why probably a lot of Black people who live in this country almost feel silenced. And that, again, that dissonance and indoctrination is setting where they feel like they can't say anything. The overt racism is so insidious and subtle that before you even know it, you're just not saying anything, or you're living a certain way, or you're acting a certain way. Whereas in America, if they don't like you, they're going to call you the N-word and try and lynch you. You know, at least you can run from that and deal with that. But over here, silent, deadly snakes that will... Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's totally different. The racism... I actually prefer... and I'm not a Trump supporter. I'm not a Trump supporter. Don't get it twisted. But I would rather sit with a man like him, because you know where you stand. Do
you know what you're dealing with?
Yeah.
Rather than this Tory government that we've got at the minute, who will have things like the Grenfell Fire Tower, and 2.5 years down the line, less than 10 families have been paid out, and less than 20 have got a new place.
Just want to back you up on something, or ask you a question actually. Have you ever read Joel Augustus Rogers' Nature Knows No Color Lines?
No, I haven't.
No. I would say to all the viewers out there who want to obviously understand the construct of race, to read that book. It's a great book.
Amazing. What's it called?
Nature Knows No Color Lines.
And what's the author called?
Joel Augustus Rogers. Rogers was a humanist who believed there were no scientifically evident racial divisions. All humans belong to one race.
I'm going to look into that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So just going back then, just to kind of summarize and reclaiming our past, what do we need to do?
I got it here for you.
Okay.
All right, what you can do is you can put this link in your description. There's something called a timeline, which was written by a guy called Paul Abina. He was from Manchester. I know him personally, amazing guy. And he has got an organization called Lineage Innovations, and he's written something called a timeline, and it's a timeline of the African diaspora. And essentially it's written on a piece of paper, and it's in a scroll, and you roll it out and you roll it out and you roll it out and you roll it out, and you'll get one man to stand in one end of the room and another man to stand, and literally it's feet. Wow. It's a good 20 foot, if that makes sense, and it shows all of our history, all of our lineage. So for me, start right back at the beginning. I can give you a bit of a quick synopsis.
Yeah.
The first man, Homo sapiens sapien, 3.2 million years ago. I'm being real out here. Let's go right back to there. If we're talking about the first modern human life, genetic coding, mitochondrial DNA, or the Eve gene, 250,000 to 200,000 years ago. If we're talking about the first and the second wave migrations out of Africa and how that happened and why that happened, if we're understanding how the environment and how nature changed physical features and mental attitudes, if we understand about migration and how cultures rose and fell, if we understand how languages came up and down, where the roots words come from, if we understand about the rich history of great empires like Tassiti and Kush and Nubia and Kemet and Mali and Ethiopia, which was the only country that was never conquered. You know, things like that.
Yeah.
Once you start to learn these things, you start to walk with chest and think, wait a minute, I don't come from slaves. And it's that what I love. It's that what I want people to re-educate themselves with. Black history is world history is my dad's mantra. He has got an organization called Black History Inspires, and he's been doing Black history for years. He also does genealogy and family history. And I think part of the reason why I'm quite confident in my blackness and my identity is because I've known from pretty early on, from teenage years, about my ancestry, about my history, about where I'm coming from. I'm still finding out today. I found out the other day that I'm 1.7 Iberian, 1.7% Iberian. I was like, what? 39.6% Nigerian. You know, it's things like that. So there's that, the miseducation bit. I've written down dismantling racist structures in society. That's massive. Clearly, that's a massive task. So it's about being aware of things like our banks, our institutions, our universities, our historic buildings that we see knocking about, that have been literally floated through capitalist and slave money, if you want to call it. It's about knowing these things, because when you visit these places, you then have a different relationship or interaction with these places. It's about challenging structural racism where you see it, and systemic racism and barriers where you see it, and you can do it in your everyday life. You don't have to be at the table speaking to the man and the power broker to do it. I've put down economics, powernomics, blackonomics, whatever you want to call it. It's about supporting each other economically. It's about spending with each other. It's about ensuring that we have that money in our community, because we all know, I think you were talking about it on one of your shows, that in the Jewish community, the pound stays there for like 16 days. In the Chinese community, do you know? But in the black community, it stays for like 16 minutes. You know, come on now. We need to hold on to our money and start buying black straight up. And that also includes, on a wider level, more investment in black entrepreneurship and businesses and endeavors. And that also includes work with the continent, work on the continent. And there's so many opportunities in Africa now, particularly tech and STEM opportunities that we could be getting involved in. It could be sponsorship. It could be, do you see what I mean? So much stuff that we can be doing economically. And just also recognizing the second scramble for Africa at the minute is sick. If you look at what China's doing, if you look at what the USA is doing, if you look at what India is doing, you know, it's about understanding that economically on a world level, how Africa is being looted yet again. But also, when there's this whole rhetoric around, oh, we give so much aid to Africa, I think this country gives about approximately 250 mil a year, but they don't talk about how much Africa gives us. You know, they don't talk about how much African people in this country then send back out. Does that make sense? And it's much more. They don't talk about those things. And then the fifth thing I put down was trauma and PTSS. PTSS, have you heard of that?
No, I've not heard of that.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome.
I've not heard of that one.
It's a real thing. One of our first inaugural events that TAP put on was a mental health event that we put on at Manchester Metropolitan University. And we got a couple of academics in, a couple African-centered psychologists in to speak about it. And it's a real thing out here. If you understand about epigenetics and if you understand about generational trauma, and if you understand about PTSD, then PTSS must be real. So a lady called Dr. Joy DeGroy, over I think about 12 years of research and real scientific, quantitative and qualitative research, has come up with this theory called post-traumatic slave syndrome. And it's basically a way in which Black people navigate through the world at a deficit. A theory that explains the etiology of many of the adaptive survival behaviors in African American communities throughout the United States and the diaspora. It is a condition that exists as a consequence of multi-generational oppression of Africans and their descendants, resulting from centuries of chattel slavery, a form of slavery which was predicated on the belief that African Americans were inferior to whites and weren't humans. And this was then followed by institutional racism, which continues to perpetuate injury. And she has come up with this theory, the resulting MAP or MAP, multi-generational trauma combined with continued oppression, microaggressions, systemic racism, overt covert racism, absence of opportunity to heal or access to the benefits available in society leads to post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Wow.
So we know that there is a disproportionate level of Black people who are represented in the mental health system, disproportionate level of Black people who present with chronic health issues and diseases, disproportionate levels of Black people who are in the criminal justice system, who are failing in school, etc., etc. And this points to it. It's amazing. It really speaks to our condition.
What was that lady's name?
Go on.
What was that lady's name? Sorry.
Professor Joy DeGruy. So DEGRUY. And she goes on further to talk about what it looks like in terms of the key patterns of behavior. So it's adaptive behaviors to deal with the generational trauma of chattel slavery.
Excellent.
And we have adapted as a people. We've had to adapt.
Yeah,
you know. Yeah. And some of that adaptation looks like passiveness. Some of that adaptation looks like aggressiveness. Some of that adaptation might look like self-destructive behaviors. Some of that adaptation may look like lack of self-belief, worth, and identity. Some of that adaptation may look like playing down your innate skills and greatness and intellectual talents in order to get by and keep your head above the parapet so you don't get shot at. All of these adaptive behaviors that we do, some of that adaptive behavior might be talking in a certain way so people don't look at you and think, who do you think you are?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Or some white people might look at you and think, oh, you ghetto you. Some of that adaptive, it's massive. It's massive. So if anything, I think that's the biggest one, because it starts with self, and it's something that we can all individually do starting literally tonight. Excellent. If that makes sense. Yeah. Angeli,
absolute pleasure.
I just batted your head off.
Nah, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. It's been a great conversation.
It's cool.
Yeah, man. Enough respect, and thanks for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It has. Thank you so much.